Hello guys and gals, and welcome back to another episode of Haunted Gaming, the series where we take a look at the darker side of video games. Now, not a long time ago, in fact, if anything, the second episode of Haunted Gaming we did was Nanashi No Game, otherwise known as the game you probably never have heard of, and there's a good reason for it. It was a Japanese-only exclusive by Square Enix of all companies, who only really have one other horror-esque game on their platform, which is Parasite Eve, if you even want to call it that. And they ended up releasing a DS-exclusive horror title, which, by all accounts, was one of the best-looking games on the DS, and definitely one of the more interesting games on the DS entirely, and was as closest to a real-life creepypasta game as we could have gotten. Now, you can refer back to the first video where we looked at the first game, and it was essentially just a Ring remake type deal, except replace the tape with an actual game you play, an NES-style game you play on the TS, for all 7 days and uncover a puzzle through that entirely. Now, the second game also is a similar concept. You begin as a student at Nanto University, but beyond that, the game is essentially the same type deal. As far as the story goes, unless you're really into it, it's going to matter to you, but the story isn't really something that kind of pushes this game forward to me. In fact, I realized that after playing the game, it's really just a more novel concept than anything else. It's not something that I can really say is one of the greatest games that I've played in any time. It's certainly not one of the greatest horror games that I've played. But the second game certainly improves upon what the first game did. Releasing just a year after, really, 2009, after the initial 2008 release date for the first game, the second game essentially is what the first game is, except just more refined. Instead of one singular cursed game this time, you actually have two cursed games to play through. And whereas the first game was pretty simplistic, and it was meant to be, it was an NES game of all things, the second game, while it is somewhat in the same vein, you can definitely see more work and effort has been put into it, obviously being a sequel, and given another green light by Square Enix, the developers are going to put a lot more effort into it. But beyond that, it also has a platformer game, which is pretty gory of its own accounts. In fact, if you're going to play the second game, which, if you translate it to English, by the way, is the nameless game The Eye, which we'll get to in a second, the platformer part of this game is just a gory, hard platformer section of, it's just a gory, hard platformer that's difficult, and it's in the vein of an NES game entirely. That's sort of the charm of these games as well. You play them through the TS, which is the same system you get all your emails, your creepy things on, which is essentially just a DS simulation, if anything. Beyond that, though, the whole segment of the first person has sort of been revamped as well, too. At this point, one of the screens, the left one in particular, now has a cursed eye mechanic, which allows you to see things in the other dimension compared to your right eye anyways. This isn't really as impressive as the game lets on to be. In fact, if anything, after playing these games, I've realized that the third-person mechanic, well, not the third person, the first-person exploration mechanic is pretty boring. I can sort of tolerate in other games like Hotel Dusk or anything like that because it's worked upon in those titles, but in this game, it also feels like it's just a disjointed part of the core game itself. Don't get me wrong, the first-person exploration is certainly okay. It's got well, the graphics are nice, I gotta say. It definitely sets you in the mood. If you play with your headphones on, it can certainly set an atmosphere. But beyond that, it's very, very clunky. If you've ever realized how bad those classic tank controls were in a lot of these survival horror games, you're gonna feel right at home with this one, let me tell you. It definitely makes it not an enjoyable playing experience, my humble opinion myself. But aside from that, the actual enemies you encounter into it regrets, which, like the first game, are pretty easy encounters to get away with. They're certainly not difficult at all. In fact, all the game really boils down to is a very simple set of trial and error. Let's assume there are three paths, A, B, and C. If A and B doesn't work, C is guaranteed to work. Sometimes you might have to mix and match, but rarely are you ever put into that situation. It's more so just a vessel for you to keep on going from the 8-bit RPG from points and points, the platformer, the cursed game, or any of that situation, which is really where the meat of the game is. It's where you get to learn about curses and the whole backstory and things like that. It's weird. It's almost like playing a game where I really do enjoy one aspect of gameplay, but I'm sort of put up with two other aspects of gameplay that I don't really enjoy, but I'm dealing with them because the other aspect is just so damn good. And that's really the reality of Nanashi No Game Me, or Nanashi No Game The Eye, whatever you want to call it, the sequel to the original horror game that was never really released on our sides. Now, it was a Japanese exclusive, but again, it has a pretty amazing community, and they did translate the game entirely to English anyways as well, which, if you want to play it, I'm not going to say anything, but there are torrents of information out there that'll maybe help you get what you're looking for. Not that I'm advocating anything of the sort over here, that's not happening. But the game got pretty favorable reviews. The original game got good reviews as well. This game got good reviews too. For being one of the big horror titles on the DS, it earns it. But it doesn't mean that it's a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination. No. But what would this video be if I just talked about one game? No, I figured I'm going to knock out all birds today entirely in one video and leave the Nanashi no Game series completely done in my belt. Now, I mentioned that there were Apple iOS games beforehand in the first video, and there were Android games as well. There were also DSi games as well. If you don't know about DSiWare titles in particular, DSiWares are like indie titles for the DSi console exclusively, games that you could download for a couple bucks, and that would be about that. The DSiWare titles in particular are Norai no Game Chi and Norai no Game Oku, which translates to Cursed Game Blood and Cursed Game Prison. These are little standard titles. They're released around the September of 9th, 2009, which is just about a month after the actual game's release, if anything. So if you wanted to get some DSiWare titles, which are essentially just the cursed game sections of the main title, you could go out and get it. And you probably just want to do that anyways. I mean, unless you really are into the story, which at that point I'd say watch a Let's Play online or read a synopsis of anything, because the game is pretty tad boring when it comes to those first-person elements. Alongside that, the really interesting things that I noticed in this were the two mobile game adaptations. See, up until a point, these games were not touched at all since 2009, and only until 2012 were they ever really touched upon again, and they were released exclusively for Japan. One of the games exclusively came out in the Japanese territories, but one of the games actually made it all the way to America, and it actually got some mainstream appeal too, for a limited time. This game was called 774 Deaths. It was like the Dark Souls platformer of that era on the Apple platforms as well. And for a brief time you could download it. There were a couple of people streaming the game on YouTube, but as of now you can't really download the game anymore for a various amount of reasons. And actually, let me go to those reasons. If you have the iOS version, for example, if you ever download it on an iPhone, you'd have to download it from the Japanese store anyways. Thing is, those applications aren't available on the Japanese store. I've checked. They're not there. Or at least I can't seem to find it with any form of VPN software or anything. Beyond that, if you have a modern day device, you probably can't play the game anyways. These games came out at a time where Apple didn't require people to update with 64-bit binaries on their applications, which means that say you have a modern day iPhone, iPhone 7 Pluses, iPhone 7s, 8s, 6s, or anything like that, you can't run those if you're running iOS 11. Your applications can only be 64-bit, which means this application is forever lost unless Square Enix decides to update it, which they probably won't if the application has been removed. Chances are nobody was downloading it, it cost them money to keep it up, and they just couldn't bother with it. Beyond that, though, the application, the Nameless app, I guess you could say the cursed smartphone application, was one of the first apps of its kind. Nowadays, I play games like Innocent, which is this visual novel on the Apple platforms, where it essentially tells you a murder story all the way through text messages and live interactions. And it's a fun set of things. There's a lot of apps like that nowadays, and if you just want to, spend a night where you play maybe for like 30 minutes a night, read an interesting story, that's all fine for you. It's a visual novel. But this game was a first of its kind to really throw out Nanashi no Apply cursed applications. As far as I can say, I can only bring up screenshots of this anyways, and the screenshots are interesting. They're essentially just it's essentially a smartphone UI that you can essentially go through messages and Twitter in its universe and settings and whatnot and get weird messages and uncover a story throughout that in of its entirety, which is pretty fun, as far as I've seen through the actual interface itself. Obviously now, can't really download it, so can't really say much about it. 774 Deaths, however, I actually managed to find an APK of it. And an APK, if you don't know, is an Android version of the game too. Android copies for these mobile games have also a strange caveat as well, which I haven't mentioned. See, in Japan, the Apple platform is probably one of the leading smartphone titles, smartphone brands out there, if anything. Android is popular, but Apple just kind of has a significant market share, which means Apple, phone developers and game developers typically target iOS first, then Android. To get the games for Android, you have to be partnered with one of the big telecom companies in Japan, and beyond that, you have to download the Square Enix store for Android, and then you have to buy the application through their specific store. It's a whole heap of trouble to go through for just one game. But I'm not gonna ever promote this. If you were to ever open a new tab, behind this video and Google 774 debts in of its entirety, you might find what you're looking for. Not that I advocate an application that isn't even available for sale anymore. I wouldn't say it. As far as pricing goes, these games were priced pretty heavily, I guess, for the time. Nanashi no Apply for the iOS was about $10, and if that surprises you, go to your Apple device or go to your Android device, look up a Square Enix application, a game like Final Fantasy, and then come back to the video and tell me you're surprised now. $4 for the Death game, the 774 Debts, which, they weren't microtransactions or anything, so whatever, it's a premium price you pay for it. It was a different time back in the day. But 2012 was an interesting year, and after that, Nanashi no Game completely died off. There has never been a mention of it, and it's just been one of those games that's been sitting in limbo. Now, I'm one of those firm believers that I want to see this application come back. I feel that this franchise has a bit of potential to it as well. It was one of the leading DS games of anything, too, in its genre, which again wasn't a really populated genre, but hey, it's a big deal anyways. Clearly a lot of love and effort was put into this game, and the team behind it definitely appreciated what they had produced. But beyond that, they ended up making an interesting foray into iPhone games, when Nanashi no Apply probably led the charge on a lot of these application storytelling games out there. And the 774 Debts, a lot of people enjoyed it for what it was. I think if they ended up coming back in some way, shape, or form, specifically on the Nintendo Switch, or even just on smartphones nowadays, I'm sure Nanashi no Game can make some form of a comeback in any way, shape, or form. It might not have been the most popular game, but given how much Square Enix holds a foothold in any industry right now, whether it be the mobile games market or the actual physical, AAA games market, they have a big presence. And being one of the biggest game developers out there, not even just in Japan, but all over the world, you have to remember, Square Enix is a household name global. They could definitely come back with some way, shape, or form of Nanashi no Game, perhaps Nanashi no Game 3, the game with no name on the Switch, or they could come back with another creepy smartphone application entirely. But ultimately, this is the end of this game's video. I don't have much more to really say about this other than it's interesting. It's a fun set of games, and heck, if you really wanted to give your shot at playing The Ring, simulated on your DS, and enjoying a good old survival horror game on the classic DS system, by all means go for it. Give it a shot. But I'm going to leave this video where it's at. I finally got this out of my system. I remember coming across this game a long time ago when I first got an R4 card of all things. And years later, 10 years almost, plus actually more than 10 years, I finally finished looking at all the games, played them for myself, and I can say that while it may not be the best or the perfect experiences, I'd give it a shot. And it's definitely a game that I'm sure not many of you have heard of. That being said, this has been another episode of Haunted Gaming. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. This is me, Mudahar, and I am out.